Okay, this week we are talking about participation and voting here in Chapter 7. Now, if you have your textbook, you can see on page 169 the learning outcomes, and I will let you read those on your own. So if you want to pause and read that, I'll let you do that. I'm not going to read it to you. All right, so we'll move on and we'll look at the beginning of what political participation is. Now, if you look at your glossary, you would find that political participation are actions of private citizens by which they seek to influence or support government and politics. So basically, it's when private citizens do something to influence or support government, to support politics, to support some kind of policy they hope that the government will enact, something like that. Now, there are two types of political participation. There's what we call conventional participation, which are relatively routine political behavior that uses institutional channels and is acceptable to the dominant culture. And then we have unconventional participation, which is relatively uncommon political behavior that challenges or defies established institutions and dominant norms. So those are the two types of political participation that we look to. So two possible examples of conventional behavior, conventional participation are voting. That is something that is accepted by the dominant culture. It is part of an institutional channel that has been established for people to make their voices known. Letter writing, you can nowadays you can actually go on to the congressional website or the White House website or the governor's website, and you can actually send them an email. And that their office will receive immediately, and usually they will respond. Now, sometimes it might take a while before they respond, but normally they will respond. There are other ways that you can do political participation. You can run for office. That's conventional. You can do lots of other things that as long as it's something that's accepted, that's by the norm, et cetera. Even a protest, as long as it's following the law and not breaking the law in any way, would be conventional. Now, unconventional is uncommon. They challenge or defy established institution, dominant norms. They are not normal. They are things like sit-down strikes. That's where you would go on strike somewhere and you would actually be on the person's property, which is illegal. That's what makes it unconventional. And you would sit down and refuse to leave. That would be an unconventional participation. There are other types of unconventional participation, such as terrorism. That would be a premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents, usually intended to influence an audience. So basically, terrorism is when people use violence of some sort to achieve a political means, and that is definitely unconventional participation. So there are lots of different ways that you can look at unconventional participation. And that's what we're going to look at in our next little section. If you look in your book on page 171, there is a picture of, it's image 7.1 if you're using a different edition, and it's the March for Freedom. And you'll notice that this is a picture 50 years later, back when President Obama was president in 2015, but it's a commemoration of 50 years of the 50th anniversary of the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge outside Selma, Alabama. And what was going on was they were marching. There was a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama to protest for voting rights for African Americans. And it was unconventional in the sense that it was blocking a road, and that's not normally conventional. But it really had a major impact. Normally, unconventional participation doesn't accomplish much, but this time it did, because the police actually beat and arrested several of the people during that protest, and that was caught on camera, and it began to change the opinions of the public. Now, most people know less about unconventional participation. Political scientists know less about it. It's easier to collect data on conventional practices, and most political scientists are biased towards conventional politics. In other words, that's what we study as a political scientist. That's what you study. That's what you learn. So you're more biased towards that. Let me just say this: there are some instances of unconventional political participation that has gone on in our country. The Boston Tea Party, for instance, is an example of unconventional political participation. That is something that's not normal, but that's something that has happened. Now, is it effective? There are times when it is. There's a type of unconventional participation called direct action that involves assembling crowds to confront businesses and local governments to demand a hearing. They did a lot of that during the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s here in the United States. And they directly pressured businesses to change policies. They directly pressured Congress to change policies. And so while normally unconventional participation does not get much, there were some instances in the civil rights movement that did allow for some unconventional participation to be successful. And so that is very interesting to note from time to time. Let's see. This is a picture of that March for Freedom. That was 45 years later. This would have been in 2010. I'm using an older PowerPoint. All right. What Americans think is conventional political participation. Petitions, most Americans see that as clearly conventional. And 70% of people have done it. So 24% might do, 6% would never do. I personally have done it. Boycotts, that's questionably conventional. Boycott is when you refuse to do business with someone. A famous example of that actually did bring about change was the Montgomery bus boycotts. After Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up a seat to a white man, they boycotted the Montgomery bus system for several months, led by Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., and it actually did have some effect, and they eventually changed their policies and integrated the buses a little better. But some people would consider that unconventional. Some would consider it conventional. I don't think it's unconventional because you have freedom of choice as to who you're going to do business with. So for my personal opinion is that it's conventional. 20% of Americans have done it. I actually have done that. I don't normally do that and don't normally even condone it, but there are occasions. 53% might do, 27% would never do. Demonstrations, which I have also participated in. The ones that I participated in, of course, were done legally. I would not probably be involved in one that is illegal, but that's why what I've done is conventional. But if I had actually trespassed on private property to do the protest or whatever, that would put it into the category of unconventional. But 15% of people have participated, 55% might, and 30% would never do. Even though those are conventional, or pretty much conventional, or can be conventional, not as many people participate in these as, say, voting, for instance. Unconventional participation around the world, I'm going to let you read about that in your book. Here's an anti-war protest in 2013. Now, conventional participation, there are two types of conventional participation. There's what we call supportive behavior, which is action that expresses allegiance to a government and a country. For instance, reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, singing the national anthem, flying the American flag on holidays. Those are ways that you can support your government, your political system, your country, etc. They usually require little effort, knowledge, or personal courage. They don't require a lot of initiative on part of the citizen. The simple act of turning out to vote is a show of support for the political system, so that is a supportive, that can be included as supportive behavior. You can serve as an election judge in an election. I've done that as well. You can organize a holiday parade, demand greater initiative, things like that. Then there's what you call influencing behavior. This is when you want to modify or reverse government policy to serve political interests, okay? And there are lots of ways you can do that. Usually, influencing behavior is based on self-interest. It's something that you believe in, something you think the government should do. Particular benefits. Some citizens try to influence government to obtain benefits for themselves, their immediate families, or their close friends. They might pressure their alderman, which is like a city council person, to rebuild curbs on their street or to vote against an increase in school taxes, especially if they have no children. When I have participated, for instance, one of the protests and demonstrations that I participated in was several years ago at the state legislature in Austin. And they were, at that time, teachers did not have, there was no statewide health insurance program for public school teachers. And so there was a big rally, and we went and visited legislators in their offices. And then we had a big rally and demonstration there at the Capitol. And that's one that I did. And that was partly for my self-interest, because I felt like as a teacher, we deserve some kind of health program for the entire state, for teachers in the entire state. So often it is motivated to benefit yourself. Okay. We also find that local government usually finds people demanding more from it than the national government, because we're closer to the local government. It's easy to call your city councilman or school board member because you probably know them, or you might know them. You have a better chance of being acquainted with or running into or speaking to a state representative or state senator, or even the governor, than you would a U.S. representative, a U.S. senator, or the president. So the local government usually affects our lives more readily and more closely, so we tend to demand more from them than we do others as well. Campaign contributions would be something that would be influencing participation, influencing behavior. This is when you donate to someone's campaign to see about them to get them elected. There are different kinds of broad policy objectives. For instance, a low initiative activity that is seeking to influence is voting. That's something that doesn't take a lot of initiative to do, but it does often have an effect. You elect people, you vote for people who will support issues that you personally believe in. There are some high initiative activities such as running for office, and there are also some like class action lawsuits like the Brown versus Board of Education that actually did bring about a change in government policy. But that was a much more high initiative. In other words, that requires more desire on your part and more effort on your part to do than, say, going out to go voting. Conventional participation in America, voting is the most common form of participation. I might argue with that. I would say maybe saying the Pledge of Allegiance is, because we do it in schools all over the country every day. But as far as like most people are concerned, voter turnout, U.S. voter turnout is not high compared to some other countries. We do have a problem with that, and that is that, sometimes we have a lot of elections. I can usually think of 2 to 3 elections per year that go on in the state of Texas, and sometimes more than that, because you think about it, you have a city council election, you have a school board election, you have on off years, on the odd numbered years here in Texas, we have usually an election to vote on constitutional amendments. Then you have your even number years, which are not presidential election years, which then would include a primary election for your candidate. And then you will still have school board, and you will still have city council. And then you will still have the general election in November, which could include not only candidates for House of Representatives and Senate and governor, but also for constitutional amendments. Then you have your even numbered years that include a president. So then you have your convention, your primary elections and all that. So there are a lot of elections in the United States. And so sometimes people get a little tired of voting. There are also some people who are just not motivated to go vote very much. We'll just keep going through that. Now, participation through voting. And one of the things we want to do is we want to trace the expansion of suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote. And we're going to assess the impact of expanded suffrage on voting turnout. We'll probably let you read that about that in your book. But the Constitution left enfranchisement to the state. In other words, Constitution allowed states to really be the determining factor in voting who would get to vote and all of that. Early on, it was based on tax paying or property holdings. If you had a lot of land, you would probably get to vote no matter who you were. Well, that's not true. If you were a white man who had a lot of land and paid a lot of property taxes, you would get to vote. Most everybody else did not. Now, as time moved on from the beginning of our country to the early 1800s, it eventually was expanded to include most states. It included all white men in allowing them to vote. The next big step was enfranchisement of black people. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment made former slaves into citizens, and the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. And so that expanded the enfranchisement of people, expanded suffrage from just white men, rich white men, to then all white men, then to all men, black, white, and et cetera. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 also expanded that later during the civil rights movement, which many states in the South had enacted laws to prevent black people from voting. And so the Voting Rights Act basically ended that. And there are some court cases there that you can look up and see about how that expanded as well. We also talked about the enfranchisement of women. Suffragettes, which are women who supported the right to vote, began organizing in the mid-1800s. And oddly, it came out of a couple of different movements. You had the Second Great Awakening, which was going on, which kind of empowered women somewhat. And that kind of gave birth to the abolition movement, which then included a lot of women. Well, and as these women were working in the abolition movement to end slavery, they began to think, well, why are we fighting for someone else's rights that we also don't have? So that came out of that. What was born out of that was the women's rights movement, the first one. And it began a movement to gain the right to vote or to try to gain that as time moved on. Now, the first state that actually granted women the right to vote was Wyoming. And the western states kind of led the way on this for a couple of reasons. Number one, in order to be a state, you had to have a certain number of people who were eligible to vote in your state, and they didn't have enough men, so they included women. They also did it to draw more people out there, because if they thought if they could allow women's right to vote, that might draw more people to their state. Colorado was next to grant that right in 1893, and finally in 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed, and it was ratified in 1920, and women had the right to vote in the 1920 presidential election for the first time nationwide. Now, they were not, like I said, there were some states that allowed it. Montana had already allowed it, and by the time the 19th Amendment was passed, Montana had a female in the House of Representatives. The last major expansion of suffrage or right to vote in the United States was in 1971, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. Most states, again, it was states that allowed, that set voting rights for the most part. And some states did allow voting to begin as low as 18, but the 26th Amendment lowered it to 18 for everyone across the country. And the reason for that is the Vietnam War was going on, and there was a draft. There were many young men being drafted to go fight and die in Vietnam, and the thought was, if our country can elect representatives who can then force me to go fight in a war, then why don't I have a voice in that vote? Why don't I have a say in that? And so that really began for a push, and they added the 26th Amendment to the Constitution, which lowered the voting age to 18. The United States has consistently led the way in the world in political equality, and we're often criticized for mistakes in our past, and certainly we should look at those, take a hard look at our mistakes and learn from those mistakes. But please don't forget that our country has led the way in voting rights and in equality and in other ways around the world. We allowed women and blacks and others to vote before most other countries in the world, and that's very important to keep that in mind. In the progressive movement of the early 1900s, they wanted to change politics, and so they instituted a system of direct primary, which is where the voters would actually determine who was going to represent the parties in elections. Before this time, party bosses actually made the choices, so who was going to represent the party in the presidential election, in Senate races, in House of Representative races, governor races, all that. The direct primary would bring the citizens directly into that. They also instituted what was called a recall. Texas does not have this policy. The next three that you see, recall, referendum, initiative, Texas does not have those, but many states do. A recall is when the citizens of a city or a state are upset with a politician. If they get enough registered voters to sign their petition, they can then force a new election and try to elect someone else. That has happened in many cases over the history since this has started. One of the more popular ones was in California. Several years ago, they had a recall election, and Arnold Schwarzenegger actually ran in that recall election and was elected the governor of California. So that does happen sometimes. A referendum is when the state legislature passes a law, but then the people have a right to vote on whether it actually becomes a law or not. Again, we don't have that in Texas. And the initiative is where citizens can actually propose a law, and if they get enough people to sign their petition, it has to be put on a ballot and let the citizens of the state vote on that particular law. The dark orange ones are the states that have all of these. The light orange have initiative and at referendum. The ones with the diagonal lines have initiative. The medium color orange has recall only. The ones with the horizontal lines have a referendum, and then the gray ones have none of the above. All right, I'm going to let you look and read about voting for candidates in your book, as well as patterns of participation over time, the standard socioeconomic explanation. I'm going to let you read about all that in your book. There is a low voter turnout in America, and the voter turnout has declined over time. Part of that is because as the number of people who are eligible to vote increases, the percentage of people who actually vote decrease. So, for instance, when the 26th Amendment was passed, people from 18, 19, and 20 years old are less likely to vote than older people. And so, yes, you have more people who are eligible to vote, but since such a small percentage of them actually get out and go vote, that decreases the overall percentage of the voter turnout. So that's one of the things. The United States has seen a greater decline than other democracies. There are reasons for that. There have been a change in attitude towards politics and political parties. Watergate, Vietnam, those kind of things brought a lot of disgust towards politicians and politics and government, and a lot of distrust. And so a lot of people just don't vote because they just don't believe it matters. And so there needs to be some kind of way that government can restore people's faith in voting effectiveness. We're going to just keep going. I'll let y'all read about that in your book. All right, I'm going to let y'all read about those in your textbook, but I just wanted to kind of touch base with you on Chapter 7 and the primary concepts here. Let me know if you have any questions. I hope you have a good day.